Welcome to Jejuporum 2020. I'm Peter Hayes, Director of the Nautilus Institute. It's my honor to moderate this panel. Today's session is organized by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network of Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament, or Apln for short. Today's session has a topic: reinvigorating nuclear arms control agreements. These agreements have been at the center of virtually every major reduction in nations' nuclear arsenals over the decades. They continue to present a valuable way to safeguard the future of humanity. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, coming into force. The 10th review conference of this treaty is meant to take place in New York next year, although the pandemic has put the timing in doubt. This session of the Jejuporum will discuss the effects of nuclear arms control agreements, especially in light of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, and will aim to address the following questions. Has the NPT been effective? If so, why? And if not, why not? Is a new focus on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons merited, or is this just a distraction from the core task of non-proliferation and disarmament? What of the Hiroshima urgent appeal signed last summer, calling for a renewed commitment to international arms control and disarmament? Let's open with 7 to 10-minute presentations by each panelist on this topic, followed by a moderated dialogue on some critical questions. But before we actually begin, I'd like to introduce our 4 distinguished panelists. They are Ambassador Nobuyasu Abe, former Undersecretary General at the United Nations for Disarmament Issues; Lord Desmond Brown, Vice President of the Nuclear Threat Initiative; Ambassador Suk Kim, the former ROK Ambassador to the United States; and Professor Ramesh Thakur at the Australian National University. Each of these panelists has a very distinguished career, too long to go over today, both as practitioners of nuclear arms control and disarmament and in the scholarly analysis of critical issues. But I do want to note that all are affiliated with the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, and we thank them in advance for their willingness to make their presentations today. We'll proceed in alphabetical order, starting with Ambassador Abe, then Lord Brown, then Ambassador Kim, then Professor Thakur. I'd like to proceed informally, so henceforth I'd be grateful if everyone could refer to me as Peter, and we'll refer to each other by our first names. So Ambassador Abe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting to this wonderful panel. I understand now it's in alphabetical order. I'm always number 1 either in the English alphabets or also in Japanese alphabets. R comes first, so I am accustomed to it. So nuclear arms control, which has been backbone of nuclear disarmament arms control, is crumbling, as you said. The INF Treaty, US and Russia have abandoned. US withdrew from the Iranian Nuclear Agreement, JCPOA. New START Treaty is now threatened to be abandoned. CTBT, the Test Ban Treaty, is not in force yet. So now people are blaming the United States or Russia for this breakdown. I think both of them are to blame, because in the United States, that traditional skepticism about anything called arms control has gained the power, and they are pushing the move to withdraw from any arms control treaty. Russia has discovered the utility of nuclear weapons because it feels conventional inferiority around the country. So both of them have lost their strong incentives to maintain arms control treaty. I think that's a basic force behind. Now, we have to strengthen or bring back, reinvigorate nuclear arms control to bring stability and reduce the risk of any chance of nuclear war. But to do so, I think we have to not simply go back to the old agreements, but we have to think about establishing a new framework, because those decades that have passed brought in new factors. China has now become power competitive with the United States or comparable to Russia. Therefore, there has to be a framework for a new player. Also, during the past decades, we have had emergence of cyber technology, AI, artificial intelligence, space technology. Those things are blurring the border between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. Well, because those new technologies are not nuclear, they're placed within the category of conventional, but they're not really conventional. And those things are affecting the operation of nuclear forces, and that is threatening the stability. So any new framework has to take those factors into account. And it's not easy, because it's not US-Russia bipolar negotiations. It has to include China or even more nuclear powers. And it has to include not only the number of bombs, but it has to include other factors, as I mentioned. You say it is difficult. Yes, it is difficult, but it's not impossible. Remember, about a century ago, there's such thing as Washington Naval Agreement, in which US, Britain, Japan agreed to limit the total tonnage of their warships to the portion of 553. But that is very often referred to, but in fact, there were also other participants, France and Italy. So it's already complicated. The treaty not only limited the total tonnage, but it also limited the individual tonnage as well. So even with the succeeding London Naval Agreement, it is already complicated. So it was done in the past. So it should not be impossible this time again. In this connection, we have to look to the NPT as well. NPT, I think, basically has succeeded in preventing proliferation. Japan, West Germany, Korea, those countries did not try to acquire nuclear weapons. Australia either. So in that sense, it made a good initial success. But later on, it has started to have problems. It could not stop North Korea. It could not, or it went almost close in case of Iraq. It could not uncover in timely fashion Libyan operations. It could not uncover South Africa. So this NPT has to be strengthened. First of all, by universalizing the additional protocol to the safeguards agreements. That is a basic point to start with. There are some countries who are resisting, but I think the logic should tell that if the problem is that IAEA safeguards couldn't find North Korea or Iraqi activities in timely fashion, there has to be some additional measures, that is additional protocol. So it's not a matter of logical argument, but it's basically political. I suspect some of the countries are resisting because they are frustrated with the slow progress of nuclear disarmament. So I think nuclear disarmament has to be worked on. Unfortunately, the NPT's provision, Article 6 on nuclear disarmament, is fading. There's a very slow progress, and there's no good prospect of achieving the goal of nuclear disarmament. So that frustration led to Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, TPNW. I think that frustration should be understood. And some people argue that that treaty is not good because you cannot just jump on to ban the all the nuclear weapons all of a sudden. That may be true, but I think the treaty will strengthen the international norm against possession or the use of nuclear weapons. I think it still has that value. It's true that no nuclear weapon countries have joined the treaty, so it is not going to bind those countries immediately to let them give up on nuclear weapons. But I think it is still strengthening the normative value against nuclear weapons, and I think help increase the pressure for nuclear disarmament. So I think we have lots to do, and we in the Apln and Jejuporum have to keep on pressing the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nobu, and especially for your timing. So, Des, I'm going to hand the baton to you, Des.
Okay, let me start again. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your words of introduction, and thanks also to the Apln and the Jejuporum for the invitation to participate in this important discussion. So I agree with Ambassador Abe. I think he's helpfully set out, the framework for our discussion, and to some degree anticipating what he and others might say. I intend to devote the time I have, which I'll try to stick to a few discrete issues. First of all, the foundation of strategic stability, which has been built up over 75 years and broadly including the NPT, has served us very well. There is no doubt that over the last 2 decades, it's beginning to show signs of neglect, in my view. I think widespread neglect. I don't just think this is a Russian-US problem. I think, we all share a part of the responsibility for neglect. We may not share the responsibility for the assault that it is now under from some parties, but I don't think we nurtured this well enough and supported it. And, as I've heard people say, it's like the brakes on a car. You don't really appreciate that you have neglected them until they fail. And this is in danger of failing, in my view. But there are 2 aspects to this. We're going to discuss arms control. The part of the world that I live in, the Euro-Atlantic space, has relied for the stability on both arms control and other pillars of peace, including legally binding confidence-building measures. And we're losing them too. We're days away from losing the OST, and this is a significant worry to us as well. Anyway, contrary to what I expected, I can start today on what may prove to be a relatively positive note. On Monday, I noticed, reported in the Wall Street Journal, that quoting a US administration official, that the US and Russian negotiators had made progress on a new framework accord that would freeze each of their nuclear arsenals and outline the parameters of a detailed treaty to be negotiated next year. So those are the words that I quote from the Wall Street Journal. I haven't seen it, to be honest, reported very extensively otherwise. If this proves to be a durable accord, it would give Russia an extension of the New START treaty in order to create space for that conversation to take place in those negotiations, which, as we've heard, is due to expire in early February. But time will tell. And as we're recording this before the US presidential elections, the durability of it will be already apparent, I think, to our audience when it is broadcast. So we know that Joe Biden, the Democrat nominee, favours the extension of New START for the foundation of future arms control agreements. But regrettably, he hasn't given us any details of what those arrangements might be. And why this is important is that we cannot underestimate the importance to the NPT of extending New START. There is no single act that could better ensure a positive review conference than US and Russia agreeing to extend the New START treaty. And equally, the opposite would be the case too. There is no single act that could damage that prospect so significantly as failure to do that. in May of last year, in a statement to the 2019 NPT PrepCom, I and others stated the following in quite a long statement. And I quote, "Further progress in nuclear disarmament, or in the very least active negotiation to that end by the US and Russia, is at the core of their NPT Article 6 obligation to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race." So that's quoted in short. It's in another context. The disarmament leadership from the US and Russia, who have enormous responsibilities in this regard because of the size of their arsenals, it is critical to the essential task of engaging the world's other nuclear armed states and achieving a world without nuclear weapons. And failure by the US and Russia to take the necessary steps would be interpreted as a violation of their Article 6 obligations and threaten the underpinning of the NPT regime, in my view, with some justification. Ambassador Abe reminded us of the continuing importance of nuclear arms control and some of the many reasons why, although the NPT has served us well over the years, and I don't think there's any doubt about that, but we shouldn't attribute all of this success, of course, to the nuclear weapon states. The non-nuclear weapon states have, in my view, been the heroes of the NPT, and with a couple of minor exceptions, but important exceptions, but in scale terms minor, the non-nuclear weapon states have stuck to this deal very well. But it's being challenged now, as we heard, and outdated in the modern world. And the aspect of that list of reasons which Ambassador Abe gave us that I want to dwell on just for a few seconds is the problem caused by emerging technology. There are two aspects to this which trouble me greatly. I mean, all nuclear weapon states and nuclear armed states, to some extent or another, seem to be modernising, if not having already modernised in some cases. US and Russia are developing terrifying new weapons, which are destabilising. In the Russian case, two of them already covered by New START, but others would require completely new arms control regulation. Hypersonic missiles, one of which I understand was tested yesterday to celebrate President Putin's birthday, that challenged conventional understanding of response times and consequently first strike, and nuclear-powered torpedoes and cruise missiles are making us rethink what is credible deterrence. And to make matters worse, and this is the area that I'm really concerned about, technologies like artificial intelligence, lethal autonomous weapon systems, and cyber weapons, and I could go further, change the parameter of what is a credible threat and our ability to be able to know from where it originates, which is a foundation of deterrence. But they also generate a vulnerability to command and control of nuclear weapon systems. And none of this is regulated. And attempts that are being made to regulate them are failing. Failing against the vetoes of countries. In my case, in the United Kingdom, I'm disappointed of their inability to be able to agree a general consensus about what an autonomous weapon is in order for some form of regulation to be agreed, at least among those who are discussing this. So all of this is being done overtly to increase the effectiveness and the deadliness of weapon systems in an environment where there is no internally accepted rules and regulations for any of these technologies, and none of the countries with the big nuclear arsenals consider this to be anything of a priority. And let me, in the interest of time, just move to my final point, which is about the TPNW. All in all, there is a strong perception that the NPT is in bad shape and the risks are becoming obsolete. And in the end, collapsing because of a combination of proliferation challenges and endless disputes about disarmament. So in July 2017, as we were told, and I don't need to repeat this, 122 NTP members voted in favour of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and it is moving towards ratification. For the countries who oppose it, the treaty is ineffective, but also potentially undermining the NPT. Personally, I agree with the view that the focus on this treaty, rather than engagement with its underlying argument, suits the nuclear weapon states, ironically. It's simpler for them to argue that a ban treaty without the participation of nuclear powers could not be effective. It's easy for them to argue that the treaty and its proponents don't explain how you deal with major security threats in the absence of nuclear deterrence. It's easy for them to argue how the deficit of how you verify and enforce this treaty makes it a problem rather than a solution to anything. And I think all of this plays into the nuclear weapon states agenda. And while I understand the frustration that led to it, I favour the outcome of this treaty. I regret that we moved from the campaigning phase of this to the actual agreement of the treaty, because I will never forget the experience I had at the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons in 2014, when a large number of young people confronted representatives of the administration, both of the UK and the US, about these weapons, and made them very, very publicly uncomfortable in an argument about the impact of these weapons and their consequences, rather than technical discussion about how you use them and control them. So the alleged shortcomings of the treaty and its criticism will not, in my view, undermine the NPT, but I regret that we did not stay in that space longer, because it seems to me that that is the best argument for control of these weapons and their eventual elimination. I'll end there, Peter, because I have other things to say, but we'll have a discussion and we'll be able to talk more broadly about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Des. Now, Suk, 10 minutes, 7 to 10 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Peter, and greetings from Seoul. I also thank Ambassador Abe and Mr. Brown for their excellent presentations. I was at the annual Doomsday Clock unveiling ceremony held in Washington, D.C. early this year. The clock ticked to 100 seconds before midnight. Participating scientists and scholars highlighted the looming man-made catastrophe brought by the twin threat of nuclear weapons and climate change. Nuclear disarmament and the response to climate change are indispensable for international peace and security. The international community is looking to the US and Russia currently to take initiative for disarmament. As Des has mentioned briefly, negotiators from both sides met in Helsinki on Monday. The US envoy said the meeting yielded important progress. But in Moscow, Foreign Minister Lavrov accused Washington of unilateralism. He said the New START would likely cease to exist. This is a seriously alarming sign that implies both the US and Russia are taking the path quite opposite from disarmament. Extending the New START is the most pressing issue at this moment because it is the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty as of today. The depressing reality has exacerbated even further as the value of multilateralism and the spirit of international cooperation have been undermined by the Trump administration. The US is aspiring to strike a strategic balance among the nuclear powers. It originally wanted to install a new nuclear arms control framework that is no longer bilateral, but trilateral by including China for the first time in nuclear disarmament history. Russia stands for an unconditional extension of the New START treaty. China has rejected the US proposal of the trilateral nuclear disarmament negotiation. The huge gaps remain in the understanding and interest of the three countries. Both the US and Russia should come forward to set examples to the rest of the nuclear weapon states, as well as to non-nuclear weapon states by taking a disarmament initiative. The desirable first step would be the two countries reaching an agreement and extending the New START before February next year. They have only 4 months in their hands. The issue of including China in the framework can be discussed later. What makes matters worse are nuclear ambitions of North Korea and Iran and the likelihood of major nuclear powers resuming nuclear tests. These clearly expose the loopholes and weaknesses of the international nuclear arms control regime. The NPT, along with the CTBT, is the foundation of today's international nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation agreements. The NPT has made considerable progress in terms of non-proliferation, but regrettably not so much in the area of disarmament. After the NPT was taken into effect in 1970, India, Pakistan, and Israel have become a new nuclear weapon states. The increase in the number of nuclear states reveals NPT's fundamental problem, it being an unfair treaty. Another risk for the NPT is that North Korea set a negative precedent. It is the only member state that withdrew from the treaty in 2003 after taking advantage of being a member since 1985. Now, Iran is making a claim to follow suit. Under these troubled circumstances, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is expected to be taken into effect soon with the ratifications of 50 or more countries. The problem is the TPNW is in conflict with the NPT framework as it illegalizes the nuclear possessions as a whole. Also, the fact that neither major nuclear powers nor their allies are the members of the TPNW raises a universality problem. Moreover, the feasibility of the current version of the treaty is questioned. Some 70 countries did not even participate in the vote. Some countries are hesitant to join due to the risk to their national security, and the treaty lacks the effective and reliable verification system. On the other hand, the NPT has undoubtedly been the driving force of the international nuclear non-proliferation regime for the past 5 decades. We should not simply incapacitate it on the grounds that nuclear disarmament has not been fulfilled. We need to recognize that meaningful progress cannot be drawn without making improvement in the international security environment in a broad sense. This is the game of reality, practicality, and feasibility. Therefore, the NPT and the TPNW should be designed and operated in a way that is not conflicting, but complementary and mutually reinforcing. In order to ensure the stable international order and taking into account the realistic limitations that nuclear disarmament will take a long time, it is crucial to revamp the current NPT framework as a whole. However, it is difficult to make workable progress with the NPT review process alone. Extraordinary sense of international solidarity and effective multilateral diplomacy are essential to come up with a reasonable alternative. In particular, to make the NPT hold relevance for the original purpose and spirit, we should encourage both nuclear and non-nuclear states to make joint efforts to disarm while continually strengthen the non-proliferation effort. In this respect, the initiatives such as the Stockholm Initiative, the Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, and the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification call our attention. I believe these initiatives could contribute to successfully convening the 10th NPT Review Conference next year. Now, North Korea's nuclear problem. As reiterated in the UN Security Council resolution, it is a threat to international peace and security, as well as a challenge for the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. You may recall the six-party talks from 2003 to 2008 aimed at deterring North Korea's nuclear ambition. They failed. After the defiant nuclear test for 6 times, North Korea presumably possesses 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. US President Trump's summit efforts in 2018 and 2019 to have North Korean leader Kim Jong-un come to terms with CVID or FFVD also failed. Nuclear ambitions of North Korea and Iran are utterly the most serious threat to the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. In order to rein in North Korea's nuclear ambition, the UN Security Council resolution should be faithfully implemented while related parties continue their coercive diplomatic efforts. At the same time, we must note that failing it could entail a nightmare of a nuclear domino in Northeast Asia and will pose a serious threat to the entire world. It is high time that we step up our efforts for North Korea's denuclearization. In conclusion, in the 21st century of interconnectivity and convergence, we need to wisely interlink and harmonize the old and new initiatives, such as the NPT and the TPNW, and create a new or combined institutional system for the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. And for this, we must gather together the collective wisdom. Thank you.
So thank you, Suk. That's terrific. We're running under time, which is great. So I'm going to hand the baton to Ramesh. Ramesh, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And I both thank and commend both the Apln and the Jejuporum for proceeding with the 2020 forum, even as a virtual event. I'd like to make 3 points without repeating anything that the previous speakers have said. One is problems with nuclear deterrence. Second is problems with nuclear disarmament as a realistic goal in the foreseeable future. And third, therefore, benefits of contemplating some practical nuclear restraint agreements as an interim measure to prepare the way for a successful NPT conference, amongst other goals. So firstly, let's recall that nuclear armed states justify possession of nuclear weapons by highlighting its defensive purpose and role, to deter a nuclear attack by an adversary. But in fact, nuclear deterrence rests on a perverse logic and suffers from a fundamental paradox. Perverse logic in the sense that its core predicate is that the best guarantee of non-use is the conviction instilled by every nuclear armed state in all the others, that if push comes to shove, nuclear weapons will be used. Once this is achieved, the threat of use will never have to be tested in practice. For deterrence to be effective, therefore, one state must convince another adversary state that, if attacked, it has the means and the resolve to use nuclear weapons. For deterrence to be credible, nuclear-armed adversaries must possess mutually assured destruction capability, which means in practice the capacity to ride out an enemy's first strike with nuclear weapons and still have a sufficient arsenal of nuclear weapons to hit back hard enough to cause unacceptable level of damage. And therefore the state must retain an operational nuclear capability even when subjected to a massive first strike. But for deterrence to be stable, all nuclear weapons possessor states must exercise and demonstrate restraint as custodians of nuclear weapons. As some of the previous speakers have pointed out in recent years, the roles for nuclear weapons have expanded from deterring nuclear attacks to addressing biological, chemical, and cyber threats. But the net result of broadening the contingencies in which the threat of use of nuclear weapons is justified is to lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, even against non-nuclear armed states that previously were considered to be off limits for nuclear strikes. Nobu, for example, referred to the blurring the boundaries between conventional and nuclear weapons as a result of technological developments, something that Des came back to as well. This creates double incentives for nuclear armament. Firstly, nuclear adversaries will modernize their own arsenals and raise alert levels and preparedness, and we've seen signs of that. But secondly, non-nuclear states are incentivized to pursue their own nuclear weapon acquisition programs as well. In this context, to the Chinese and Russians, the US refusal over the last few years to acknowledge mutual vulnerability and US efforts to enhance damage limitation, but also long-range precision strike capabilities, signal a higher nuclear risks threshold, including the possibility of use of low-yield bombs in some circumstances. And this creates the conditions, as the Chinese spokesman said, for a high-tech arms race that can aggravate international strategic imbalance. Now, on the second argument, while nuclear disarmament is compelling in logic and desirable in principle, I think as a goal, it remains an over-the-horizon prospect for the foreseeable future. It's not going to happen soon. In the meantime, as all the previous speakers have noted, the existing nuclear arms control agreement and architecture and framework is fraying and crumbling. And therefore, we need some practical restraint measures. Let me mention three, all of which are familiar. Firstly, we've all been reminded of the 1987 joint declaration by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. And there have been several calls from influential voices in the recent months to reaffirm that. Our sister organization, the Apln, along with King's College London, hosted 2 workshops with experts and government officials from the P5 countries in relation to the P5 process in October, November, I think, last year. And one of their recommendations was to reaffirm the Reagan-Gorbachev statement. On 5th August this year, just ahead of the 6th August anniversary of Hiroshima, the group of elders urged the P5, and I quote, to make a collective statement building upon Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev's declaration that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, as a means of building trust and improving the global atmosphere ahead of next year's delayed NPT review conference, unquote. On 26 December, just a short time ago, to mark the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on the nuclear weapons possessing states to reaffirm the shared understanding that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. Now, in his statement, I was struck by his choice of language. His use of the language of possession finesses the legal definition of a nuclear weapon state in the NPT that permanently excludes non-NPT possessor states. And that is important to us in the Apln, of course, because 3 of the 4 nuclear weapons possessing states in the Asia Pacific are now outside the NPT, of which 2 were never in the NPT. In addition, as a second restraint measure, I would like the other 7 nuclear armed states to consider expanding and universalizing amongst all 9 the no first use doctrine and postures that China and India subscribe to. Let me put to you the argument that one plausible explanation for complete nuclear reticence by China and India, despite their military clash in which large numbers of soldiers were killed on both sides for the first time since 1967, was the fact that both are committed to no first use and have practical deployment practices and postures that flow from that. And unlike every heightened tension between India and Pakistan, when nuclear flashpoint language is used immediately by governments and by analysts, in this case, despite actual deadly clashes, the rhetoric stayed completely away from nuclear weapons. And that's something worth remembering, that is a practical demonstration of the benefits of a no first use restraint regime. And so that's something that other analysts might want to contemplate and recommend the universalization of. Because what we have in the case of China and India is not just a doctrinal pledge, but the reality that in neither case are operational plans believed to require either the first use of nuclear weapons or even the threat of first use. Instead, as we know, as a safeguard against inadvertent or unauthorized use, warheads are kept off alert and delivery systems and warheads are separated. And third, and following from that, finally, I think we should encourage those countries that have weapons on high alert, and we believe there are about 1,800 such weapons today, to take them off high alert as a means of deepening strategic stability and reducing risks of that. These three measures between them, I think, will be practical demonstrations that the nuclear armed states do take seriously their commitment as responsible nuclear armed states, and therefore will prepare the ground, even though some of these states in the region are not members of the NPT.
Thank you, Ramesh. So thank you all for your presentations, and because of your discipline, we have about half an hour for dialogue before a final round robin of 2-minute comments by each of you. So let me kickstart the dialogue by asking a question and then soliciting comments. And we'll start with Nobu. Nobu, you referred to the normative power, if you like, of the Prohibition Treaty that might reduce the probability of the use of nuclear weapons or further proliferation of nuclear weapons beyond the already 9 nuclear armed states. Do you think it's possible to build bridges or coalitions of these prohibition states that sign up and ratify the Prohibition Treaty with bystander non-nuclear weapon states that don't sign up to anything but still have a stake in the issue of nuclear war and nuclear arms control and disarmament, and even of the nuclear alliance states, to put pressure on the nuclear armed states to undertake very pragmatic and urgent nuclear risk reduction measures over the next 5-10 years whilst this new world order gets sorted out in a post-pandemic era?
Okay, I think I can think of 2 ways to do so. One is those countries who are staying away from the ban treaty, basically the allies of the United States. They should stop campaigning against the ban treaty. They're joining the nuclear open states to campaign against other countries joining the treaty. I don't think that as people said, they are complementary and mutually reinforcing. You don't have to be campaigning against the treaty. So that is one way to do so. That is one way to bridge the gap. I think also countries should, in parallel, emphasize the importance of observing international humanitarian law. That was the starting point of this treaty argument. You mentioned Vienna Conference on Humanitarian Consequences. Even if we cannot prohibit the nuclear weapons, the next thing we can do is strengthen and enforce international humanitarian laws strictly. There will be very limited cases you can justify use of nuclear weapons. So that's another way of doing it. The other way may be to, those are 2 points. I may come back with this third point.
Would any of the other panelists like to make any suggestions on this question of building new kinds of coalitions? Ramesh.
I'd like to pick up something that Des said as well. There's no question but that there are problems with the ban treaty. On the other hand, I think it is equally indisputable by now that over the decades, the nuclear weapon states, the 5 of them, had used the cover of the NPT to convert what was a temporary exemption for possession for them as they negotiate in good faith into an indefinite legitimization of possession and nuclear deterrence doctrines by them under the NPT. And that's what created most of the angst. And effectively, having completed more or less the non-proliferation and peaceful uses planks, the nuclear disarmament leg got stalemated, as Ambassador Abe has said. And in that sense, the NPT's normative potential was exhausted. There was no realistic prospect of disarmament under the NPT, and the other two had been achieved. That's where the normative potential of the ban treaty comes in. Let's not forget, every country that has signed and ratified, and even those that haven't ratified, every country that has signed the ban treaty is a member in good standing of the NPT. And therefore, there is a considerable overlap. There are potential areas for tension and problems, but for most countries, the two are not seen as incompatible. They are by the nuclear armed possession states. But that's where I think it does revive the normative side and adds pressure. And if nothing else, it takes away the attempt to legitimize indefinite possession by any country. And we should not underestimate the impact of that, both as a rallying cry and as a point of problem for the possessor states.
Okay, Des, if I can just follow up, and I want also for Suk to come back on this as well, but I have a very specific follow-up on this question for Des. I think Ramesh has posed the big picture question there of legitimacy and how the different camps, if you like, line up on the NPT review and the trade-offs there. But are there very specific nuclear risk reduction measures where all these different camps have a common interest, where you could build a bridge for practical steps that could be undertaken very quickly and which are urgent? And I have in mind one example. We have nuclear hotlines, some of which go back decades to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But over the years, we've had accumulation of bilateral hotlines between China and Russia today, between Russia and the UK, between France and the UK, between India and Pakistan. I don't know if Israel has any nuclear hotlines. I know it has some hotlines. There are others out there. There's also the inter-Korean hotlines, including the UN Command, which includes the United States with North Korea. But none of these are interoperable. They're all bilateral. They're all on different standards. There's no common vocabulary. And it strikes me as basically insane in the 21st century that the commanders of nuclear armed states don't have a way of communicating in crisis to manage this kind of annihilative capacity. Maybe this is something that we could build a coalition around, that kind of very practical upgrade of the control infrastructure, so we say.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to argue against that because there is, as you point out, evidence of activity of that sort, which works. You know, I mean, I made a passing reference to the Open Skies Treaty, which is in danger of collapsing within days if the United States follow up on their threat to come out of the treaty by the 22nd of November. Although, so these things, these processes, which are confidence building, generate that kind of narrative in which people can take these steps that build trust. And I mean, the great thing about the Open Skies Treaty is, of course, that the aircraft that fly over each other's fly in each other's airspaces have international representation on board, and people who do the business, basically military people, from both NATO and Russia, or the West and Russia, are on board these flights, and relationships build up. So, it's very difficult to argue against that, and I have specifically tried to engage representatives of both sides of this argument in ideas of that nature. The problem that this particular treaty has generated, and it's not the fault of people who want to see a world free of nuclear weapons and are frustrated and think that the best way to get there is to make these weapons illegal. I have enormous sympathy for that view, and I don't condemn them for it, and I share their frustration to a degree. But the problem is that when I engage with them, they say, we have to stay absolutist about this. If we give in to what you're suggesting, then it will just be an argument against us. They will say we are making progress. You know, we have made it safer to live with these weapons. So we can't have that. And argue against what I have promoted on occasions in detail. And of course, the P5 have found it easy to adopt sort of absolutist position from their point of view. You know, their statements say we will have no truck with this treaty because it is dangerous. It generates more risk than it seeks to reduce. And it's very difficult to see how you can do that. But there are examples, and we have to build from them. You know, I myself was responsible for what has become known as the UK-Norway project, which the United Kingdom got a lot of credit for, working with a non-nuclear weapon state on how you, in disarmament, how you dismantle a nuclear weapon, how you verify a weapon has been dismantled to a non-nuclear weapon state without breaching the terms of the NPT and other and other, you know, domestic legislation that we may have had. So, I mean, I think there is a lot in that. But so, you know, what should these steps be? I mean, a very obvious step is Ramesh's encouragement for the Reagan-Gorbachev statement to be repeated, and for that to be welcomed by non-nuclear weapon states, or alternatively, if we could reduce alert times, or increase alert times rather, reduce the risk of having weapons minutes from use, and that was verifiable, then that would, I think, build the sort of trust and confidence of there. But I get depressed when I read the P5 statements. You know, the P5 statement says in 3 paragraphs of a 7-paragraph statement, the reasons why they will have nothing to do with the TPNW. They say in a couple of sentences that they support the goal of a world without nuclear weapons, and then immediately follow it by saying that they will take the steps or support the steps necessary to create an international order that will allow that to happen, without any specification, you know, of what that is. And then they go back into their domestic circumstances, and when asked why they have nuclear weapons, they say, we hold these weapons not to encourage the creation of that international order that will allow it, but to deter the use of these weapons by the other members of the P5. That's the only justification in humanitarian and legal terms for having these weapons, is to deter their use. And that's the only one that they can articulate. But yet they get away with every single time suggesting that they have to hold on to these because the world order and the security of the world and the peace of the world doesn't allow them to get rid of them. So it's very difficult, Peter, in this environment to find space in which these two groups of people can come together. So somebody has to, I mean, obviously has to mediate that. But who are these countries who will do that?
So what are your thoughts on this issue of building new coalitions, even if they're short-term, temporary ones, to try and get something done that at least gets some momentum underway in the right direction?
Okay, so I mean, I've spoken
regional.
Yeah. So I accept. I mean, I've spoken for too long on this subject. I support them all. I mean, I support all initiatives that move in that direction, and we'd happily help them to try and do it. But as you can hear from what I say, you know, I mean, I've done a lot of this dialogue over 12 years, and people say many things to me, you know, in private that they will not say in public. It's very depressing.
Well, let's shift gears slightly. Suk, if you'd like to follow up on this issue of bridging, that's fine. And then I'll follow up with another question to you. Go ahead.
Okay, following up that's a statement just now, let me slightly add one point to that. You know, there's a clear idea and position on the part of P5, and which caused many complaints and grievances from the non-nuclear weapon states. But if we look into the history and the path, there are a few organized and integrated ideas and positions on the part of non-nuclear weapon states. So, as I mentioned in my statement shortly, I'd like to revisit the idea of some the initiative. Let me take one instance from Stockholm Initiative. It invites major non-nuclear states together, not the nuclear weapon states, but non-nuclear weapon states together, and proposes disarmament measures that are achievable and negotiable with nuclear states. So I would propose some kind of meaningful dialogue among non-nuclear states vis-a-vis nuclear states to propose, to come up with some reliable proposal to the nuclear weapon states. It is very important that because we are a short time away from the next round of NPT review panel next year. So instead of throwing stones individually, I would suggest non-nuclear weapon states to have the common grounds of meeting and come up with their collective position as well. Now, before I go back to your question again, you just slightly mentioned about hotline, Korean hotline. Did I hear you right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Hotline. I have been in the diplomacy for 35 years, but I retired, 7-8 years ago. I'm a person who do not strongly subscribe to the hotline. Hotline is for to deal with some kind of crisis situation. But in this case of the the disarmament and the initiatives, I don't think hotline works. In most cases, also including in Korean cases, hotline is deadline. So it remains only by name. So I don't believe in the hotlines in this case that we are talking about.
Thank you. If I can move on, Nobu, I'd like to circle back to China, which in our region looms large, although its nuclear forces are still really only equivalent to those of one American strategic submarine in the Pacific. So we've got to be careful about how we, look at the relative capabilities. And of course, Russia has substantial forces arrayed in the Far East in Northeast Asia, right along the border. Some of them probably aimed at China, ironically, as well as other forces offshore. Its strategic submarine, missile-carrying submarines in the Sea of Okhotsk and further afield. There's a lot going on under the water in this region as well as on land. How do you think, do you have any practical ideas how one could draw China into a dialogue about strategic weapons with the United States and Russia Some have suggested that this might be done with the UK and France also in the room, but if you're going to go there, then why don't you bring in India? I don't really understand that argument. But on the other hand, I haven't seen a very practical and plausible suggestion from the Americans in particular on how to bring China into the conversation. And the Chinese themselves don't seem very forthcoming with creative or interesting ideas either, other than to say, we'll talk with the United States and the Russians come down to our force levels, which just means they're going to sit on their hands. That's about as puritanical as the Prohibition Treaty advocates can be. It really is meaningless. So do you have any practical suggestions that could be taken up at many different levels, not just by states, but by the social movements, by cities, provincial governments? It could be done at many different levels, this conversation with China.
Yes, I was about to raise the question of China. It is the big elephant now in the region, and we have to address the question of how to involve China in nuclear arms control. And China strongly objects to any idea of getting involved in the nuclear arms control. So we have to be creative in our way to approach China. I just heard this morning the discussion by Bob Zoellick. I don't know if you know him. He's a former president of the World Bank, American trade negotiator as well. He recently wrote a book and how the diplomacy, foreign policy should be conducted for the United States. And apparently he raised the example of how to deal with China. So I'm looking forward to reading his book. I think to involve China, you have to listen to what the China is saying. Otherwise, you can never include China in the negotiations. So I think one big issue is they are always saying China's nuclear possession is very small in comparison to Russian and American. Unless they come down close to China, China will not join. Okay, that's understandable. So one creative idea is to suggest to China that we are not going to ask China to reduce their nuclear holdings in the same way as Russia or the US do. And that I came up with I think, excellent format to do so. And I put it in a recently published magazine. So it is a way to oblige each country possessing nuclear weapons to reduce their holding in the ratio commensurate with the size of their possession. So if the US has 10 times more than China, if the US reduces by, say, 100, China will be asked to reduce 10% of the 10%. That means one bomb. It's not so bad, not bad deal for China. So introducing that kind of format suggestion, you may encourage China to join. But there may be still a very high barrier to do so. If that is so, I think the first step we should think about is sort of risk reduction measures, confidence building measures. And I think some people are already suggesting the mutual declaration that which weapons have nuclear weapons, which ones don't. China has an enormous number of missiles. The US also does, but we don't know which Chinese ones have nuclear weapon warheads, so which others don't. So that is quite a risky situation. If any missiles flying towards you from China, you may suspect it may carry nuclear weapons warhead, and then you have to immediately react. So that raises the risk of nuclear war starting. So by having a mutual declaration, clarification, you may reduce that risk. So we can think about a number of confidence building measures as a first step.
Thank you, Nobu. Ramesh, can you perhaps say a few words about how this question relates to South Asia? Because China, of course, in a sense, is encircled by potential nuclear adversaries. So it doesn't just have to deal with one or two, but it has to deal with quite a few different potentially cascading chains of conflict. Is there potential in the India-China relationship for some progress, some breakthrough that would bring China into a conversation that then could have ramifications for its stance at the global level?
Possibly. I just want to check, did Suk want to say something in response to the previous comment? Did I see his hand up?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, actually I did. Thank you very much. Can I?
Thank you, Rob.
Okay. Well, let me speak briefly on China before I totally forget. I agree with Ambassador Abe that there's a serious lack of confidence and mutual trust between U.S. and China, given the current situation, which is often called as the new Cold War II. So lack of confidence may lie underneath the U.S.-Chinese relations as a whole. You asked for is there whether there's some practical suggestions. I would say this may be a very clearly defined one, but let me say 3 points on this. Given the situation of lacking the mutual trust, I would suggest first, U.S. and Russia extend the current treaty before February. That's the first point. That is very important and without condition. And second, after agreeing on the extension of the current treaty without any precondition, then they could gather some steam to make some kind of momentum for joint campaign toward China, and they can have some kind of the negotiation or consultation between U.S. and Russia on the subject of how to invite China into the treaty from bilateral to trilateral. And in the process of consultation, it is quite possible that China may feel nervous at some point because they are not in the process of discussing about their destiny. And I think it is quite possible from the past history that Russia also welcomed China to be part of the framework that limits its nuclear advance. We can see in the past that from the instance of Sino-Russian territorial dispute in several decades ago. So I think the most important thing is U.S.-Russia agreeing on extension of the current treaty, and then they gather on for another dimension about how to induce China. And third, they will bring this together to Beijing. I think the third point, bringing this point to Beijing, may not be necessary. In the process of doing the second phase, China may come on board. That's my point.
Okay, shall I go back to your question, Peter?
Yes, please. And we're going to keep it brief because we're about to run out of time here. Yep, go ahead.
And I will keep it brief also because, of course, I'll be moderating another session on China, India, Pakistan nuclear equations. But if you think of what happened, or most people outside of the subcontinent don't realize, Tong Zhao, another APLN member, did a study with a Carnegie colleague where he referred to the China-India nuclear relationship as decoupled deterrence, meaning what China does is a major driver of India's policy, but China is not at all fussed about what India is doing because of various asymmetries between them. However, if you think of the clash that I was talking about in the area of the Himalayan mountains, very few non-specialists realize that in that region, the strategic geography of China, India, and Pakistan converge. That region is critical for China to have all-weather guaranteed access to its two ethnic frontiers, restive ethnic frontiers, Xinjiang and Tibet. It links China to Pakistan through the Karakoram Pass, and it brings the whole Kashmir region together as well. In that context, I actually suggested, to pick up something else that Des said, I suggested that even though the Americans have said they're pulling out of Open Skies Treaty, that we could look at adapting the principles of that to the Himalayan mountain region between China, India, and Pakistan, and see if that could be initiated there. Because if it had something like that, the movements of troops would have been picked up in advance and we could have avoided the deadly clashes in June. So again, there are things that can be learned from one region to another, adapted to local circumstances. But the reality is, as Nobu started off saying, we moved away from the bipolar structure of Russia-US nuclear relations to an interlinked nuclear chain argument, and we need to think seriously about that.
Thank you. I'd like to, Des, go ahead.
Yeah, just two figures on the OST, the Open Skies Treaty, in the context that Ramesh talks about. As he knows, the Open Skies Treaty is capable of accession. It entertains accession. I mean, it could be extended to incorporate India, Pakistan, China. I mean, it's pie in the sky, I think, given the situation it's in already. But you know, at the point of agreement, that door was left open. So that's a very strong possibility, and it would be a great loss to world security if we lost that treaty, and all of what it stands for, and the knowledge that goes with it, which could be of benefit to other people. I just want to make one other point just about this conversation. I mean, there already is. I mean, I don't want you to think I'm obsessed about this, but there already is an opportunity for China, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France to talk about disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, and that's the P5 process.
Right. If
they could be persuaded to broaden that agenda, then that could be the beginning of these discussions. They could also use it as an opportunity to reaffirm their support of the CTBT and the CTBTO, a statement of that nature. I mean, there are many things could be done. The restrictions that they place upon that agenda and the narrowness of it is their choice. But it could be broadened to have those discussions. And I just say this, privately, I know that people who participate in these discussions are well aware of the signaling that their agenda sends to non-nuclear weapon states, and also well aware that their failure to take on disarmament and non-proliferation, because the rest is peanuts really compared to that, sends a very strong signal to non-nuclear weapon states about their seriousness of both of these things. So the possibility is there. And I just finally say that I was party to the discussions that took place in London with representatives of civil society, with the P5, and I was convinced at the end of those discussions that the Reagan-Gorbachev statement was on the agenda for them to agree it. It was very close under Chinese leadership. I don't know why it didn't happen, But that was the sense I got when I left those discussions, because people specifically told me that it was very real.
Thanks, Des. Well, we're moving into the sort of final comment stage. We've almost run out of time, and we've spent a fair amount of our discussion talking about one of the elephants in the room, China. We haven't talked much about one of the viruses that fortunately is not in any of our rooms, but the pandemic. And there are two arguments I see about the pandemic at the sort of most macro level. One is that the pandemic is merely accelerating existing trends, and it's really business as usual on steroids. And the other is that the pandemic is turning a whole global international relation system inside out and backwards, upside down. But we just don't yet see what kind of system change is coming, but we're in the midst of it. And so I'd like you, in your final comments, if you could just, if you have anything you want to say about the virus and how it might affect some of the agendas we've been talking about. The obvious one is nuclear command and control, nuclear commander accountability. We've currently got our second supreme nuclear commander with coronavirus, possibly affected by the drugs that he's taking. So there are some fairly direct lines of correspondence you can draw to nuclear risk and the pandemic. But there's also these bigger picture issues of its impacts on how we think and behave in the future, including on nuclear weapons. So let's start. We'll just go again in alphabetical order. You've all got 2 minutes for your final comments. If you don't want to talk about the virus, that's fine. But I'll pose that as a question. And let's start with Nobu.
Yes, I'm advocating 3 measures for the future. The pandemic is coming again and again, as we have seen. And with the globalization of the world, I think we will be becoming more intensive than weakened. And it is also important at the initial stage, you cannot distinguish from biological weapons attack. So in that sense, it is also defensive matter. So I'm proposing 3 things. We should build an early warning system to warn what something is coming. And politicians tend to delay the reaction, as you saw in the United States, in Japan, and other places. So we have to build a system to overcome that political barriers. 2, we should build a strategic reserve of the medications, vaccines, medical facilities. 3, we have to think about anticipatory defense, which means you anticipate new viruses coming attacking. You go around the world, find unknown viruses, and you start preparing against them. 3 measures.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very sobering. Next, we'll go with Des, please.
Well, so this phrase that we want to build back better is being used extensively about how we should emerge from this pandemic, not just from the health effects of it, but from the substantial economic effects of it. This is a global generalization, but we have all discovered that our way of life has been proven to be far less resilient than we thought it would be with the advent of a pandemic. But we've also learned that of the 3 great existential risks that are there and figure in every one of our national risk registers, that is pandemic, nuclear warfare, or climate change, that there is none of them that we can deal with on our own, that they all require a level of cooperation. So surely this experience for the world must teach them that we must work together to do everything that we possibly can for future generations to prevent or mitigate the manifestation of these other 2 risks. Well, climate change is already with us and is a fact for many people in the world. So that's about transition and about resilience as much as it is about prevention. And honestly, if we don't learn this lesson from the experience we're all going through and will be for foreseeable future, then we will never learn the lesson that we need to cooperate to reduce, mitigate, or get rid of these risks. And the one that we can really deal with is the nuclear risk, because if we can remove the weapons, we remove the risk. We can't remove the possibility of future pandemics. We can mitigate, I think, the effect of climate change, but it's already with us. But we can take this risk away altogether. And if we don't learn that lesson now, we never will. I am depressed for future generations, what we are leaving them, but I'm not depressed when I talk to them. And we need to unleash that capacity of younger people who understand these things much better than some of the people who are making decisions, and realize better that only international cooperation can resolve this. And we can do it simply by removing weapons of mass destruction and their materials. We know how to do it. We've done it in part. We should complete the job.
Thank you. So,
yes, let me be very brief on 2 points about what we learned as a human being from the COVID-19 pandemic throughout this year. First, the pandemic actually contributed to a more clearly defined the notion of human security. So this is the one that should be also seriously dealt with in the arena of UN Security Council. You see, US and China have been fighting each other and finger pointing each other regarding the notion of Wuhan or Chinese or American and something in UN Security Council. So they produced no such thing as a resolution or a statement from the president or something like that. So this occasion led us to think about seriously on the extension of the function of UN Security Council, including human security issue, which is the pandemic issue as well. The second, this teaches us that the global problem requires global handling. So if we will be able to produce some kind of vaccine sometime next year, the vaccine should be treated as the global common goods. So there should be a close consultation, coordination, cooperation, as Des has mentioned, between global South and global North in distributing the vaccine as a global common goods. That's the 2 points that I have.
Thank you. So, Ramesh, you have the last word.
3 quick points. Firstly, it's a striking validation of the first proposition of the humanitarian impacts movement, that no country alone, nor the international system collectively, has the capacity to cope with the humanitarian consequences of a major crisis. We live in a world of shared fragility, but unequal resilience. We have threats that are globalized, but we do not have and need a globalization of the process of policymaking. Second, as Sukh just said, I think it demonstrates the importance of thinking outside the traditional national security box and embracing human security. That is a much better framework conceptually within which to comprehend some of our current real threats to our security. And third, the point that I think everyone's made, and that is that we need to recalibrate the balance between national efforts and multilateral cooperation. I think we don't need less multilateralism. we do need smarter multilateralism. And I don't think the existing institutions and architecture are sufficient. So we're going to have to think about how we get out of the constraints of the existing architecture without damaging the existing order in the process.
Thank you, Ramesh. Well, I'll conclude today's session here, and I'd obviously like to thank all our panelists for their terrific contributions and presentations. I actually enjoyed moderating this panel. It's actually can be fun doing this virtually, and I actually learned a lot as well, which is really wonderful. So thank you. I do, what's the term, contemplate or reflect on the fact that Jeju Island was at one point an island of really horrific warfare. And after World War II and before the Korean War, it's now an island of extraordinary beauty and peace. And I think everyone on this panel looks forward to returning to Jejuforum again to see our friends there and be again embraced by that beautiful landscape. So I'd like to thank the Jejuforum for this opportunity to speak on this really important, really existential survival topic. And I'd also like to thank the staff who have supported us in putting on this panel. And I hope everyone has a great morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are on the planet. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much.